What would you do if you bought your dream home, only to find out someone else was acting like they owned it? When I first set eyes on the lakefront property, I felt like I had stumbled upon a hidden paradise. The water shimmered under the sunlight, a deep, glassy blue, surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the breeze. The gentle slopes gave every house a perfect view, and I could already picture my kids splashing in the shallows, warm afternoons spent fishing, and evenings hosting family barbecues by the fire pit. The realtor assured me the property included a generous stretch of shoreline, more than enough for a private dock if I ever wanted one. It felt like a dream come true, the kind of home where my boys, Ethan and Caleb, could grow up carefree, spending their days outside instead of glued to screens. Moving in was a whirlwind of unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and introducing ourselves to the neighbors. Most people were friendly, waving from their driveways or stopping by with homemade cookies to welcome us. One older gentleman, Mr. Thompson, lived next door and told me how peaceful the area was. He mentioned that while the lake was shared by a few homeowners, everyone respected each other's space. That sense of community made me feel even better about the move. Ethan and Caleb were thrilled to see other kids biking around the cul-de-sac, their laughter ringing through the air as kayaks rested neatly by the shore. But not everyone was welcoming. On the second day, I noticed a woman standing stiffly at the edge of my yard, a clipboard in hand, surveying the lake as if she were taking inventory. She was middle-aged, with heavily styled blonde hair, wearing a bright red blazer, bizarre attire for a casual afternoon by the water. Something about her expression, the way she scanned the shoreline like she was measuring property lines with her eyes, unsettled me. When I approached with a friendly hello, she barely looked up. "I'm Karen," she said curtly. "Head of the Lake Preservation Committee." Before I could respond, she handed me a neatly typed sheet of rules. "Read these carefully," she instructed. "We take conservation seriously here." I glanced at the list, confused. The rules seemed oddly official, printed in bold, formal language, but the restrictions were extreme. No swimming without prior authorization from the committee, all watercraft must be pre-approved, and the one that made my stomach tighten, no children allowed on the shoreline without an authorized adult. Karen's sharp tone left no room for discussion. "Make sure your family follows the regulations," she added before turning on her heel and walking away, clipboard pressed against her chest like it held the power of law. I stood there, staring after her, wondering if she was serious. Did she really believe she controlled the lake? Maybe she was just overzealous about conservation, or maybe she'd taken it upon herself to enforce unwritten neighborhood traditions. Either way, I had too much on my plate to dwell on it. I tucked the rule sheet under my arm and went inside, shaking my head. If I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't have dismissed Karen so easily. I would have seen her for what she was, a storm brewing on the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash chaos on our peaceful new life. The first real sign that Karen wasn't just a quirky, overzealous neighbor came a few days later when my kids finally got a chance to enjoy the lake. It was a perfect afternoon, warm, with a light breeze rippling across the water. I had just finished clearing some boxes from the garage when I glanced out the window and saw Ethan and Caleb laughing as they waded along the shore, skipping rocks and letting the cool water lap at their ankles. It was exactly the kind of childhood I'd hoped they'd have in our new home. Then I heard the yelling. I rushed outside to find Karen standing near the waterline, her red blazer buttoned up tight, clipboard tucked under one arm like a soldier gripping a rifle. Her face was twisted in fury as she pointed a manicured finger directly at my kids. "You are trespassing. Get out of the water immediately." Ethan, only 12 but old enough to recognize hostility when he saw it, glanced at me with wide eyes, silently asking what he should do. Caleb, still too young to understand, looked from Karen to his brother in confusion. I walked up, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Karen, this is my property. The kids are playing on our shoreline. There's no trespassing here." She scoffed, flipping open her clipboard. That's where you're wrong. This lake has been in my family for generations. I have the paperwork to prove it. You may have a deed, but there are historical ownership rights you don't understand. I bit back my frustration. If that's the case, I'd love to see those documents. Karen snapped the clipboard shut. I don't owe you an explanation. I took a deep breath, willing myself not to escalate the situation. Look, we're new here. I don't want any trouble, but my deed clearly shows that this part of the shoreline belongs to my property. Karen narrowed her eyes. The Lake Preservation Committee has rules to prevent irresponsible usage. You're ruining the ecosystem with your reckless behavior. She turned back toward my kids, who were standing frozen, unsure of what to do. If you don't remove them from the water, I'll be forced to take further action. I wasn't about to let some self-appointed dictator bully my children, but I also didn't want to set a bad example by arguing in front of them. Ethan, Caleb, head inside for now, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Karen. I could tell she wanted me to fight her on this, to challenge her authority, but I wasn't going to play her game, not yet. That evening, I found a typed letter taped to my front door. You are in direct violation of Lake Preservation Committee regulations. Continued trespassing will result in legal consequences. This is your formal warning. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but something about the wording made my blood pressure spike. She genuinely believed she had the power to enforce these rules. And worse, she was trying to intimidate me into compliance. Mr. Thompson saw me reading the note from his porch and shook his head. She's been doing this for years, he said. Most folks just go along with it to keep the peace. Has anyone ever fought back? I asked. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Not really. She issues fake fines, threatens lawsuits. People decide it's easier to just avoid the lake than deal with her nonsense. I clenched the paper in my hand. Well, I'm not most folks. Over the next few days, I started noticing Karen's influence everywhere. Neighbors whispered about her, some rolling their eyes, others looking genuinely nervous. One family admitted they had paid her a bogus fine just to shut her up. Another told me she had once threatened to call the police on their teenagers for sitting too close to the water. Then came the kayak incident. Ethan had been excited to take his new kayak out onto the lake, a birthday gift he'd barely had time to use. He and Caleb had stored it neatly on a rack near the water, just like several other neighbors did with their boats. But the next morning, it was gone. At first, I thought maybe the wind had knocked it over, or the boys had forgotten where they placed it. But after an hour of searching, we finally found it, broken in half and dumped near the public trash bins. I felt a cold fury settle in my gut. This wasn't an accident. A neighbor named Jessica, a member of the actual HOA board, had a security camera facing the lake. When she heard what happened, she pulled up the footage. Sure enough, there was Karen, sneaking down in the middle of the night, dragging the kayak away. I stared at the grainy footage, my hands tightening into fists. This wasn't just Karen being annoying, this was deliberate property damage. I marched straight to Karen's house and knocked on her door. She opened it with an infuriatingly smug expression. I know you took my kid's kayak, I said, barely keeping my voice level. She crossed her arms. It was improperly stored. The Lake Preservation Committee has strict regulations on docked watercraft. I was simply enforcing policy. Policy? I repeated, my voice dangerously low. There is no policy. You're making this up. Karen smirked. If you don't like the rules, you're welcome to take it up with the committee. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to step back. You owe my kids a replacement. She laughed. Maybe you should teach them to follow the rules. I turned and walked away before I did something I'd regret. But inside, I was boiling. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And then, Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, she went after Mr. Thompson's dog. The morning after Karen's smug dismissal, I was still fuming over the destroyed kayak. Ethan and Caleb had been heartbroken, their excitement about the lake now replaced by confusion and frustration. But before I could even decide on my next move, the neighborhood was hit with another incident, one that turned my anger into something much worse. Mr. Thompson's golden retriever, Buddy, was missing. It started with a note left on Mr. Thompson's door, a typewritten message similar to the ones Karen had left for me. Unleashed animals pose a serious threat to the lake's ecosystem. This violation has been reported to the proper authorities. Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had lived by the lake for over 20 years, was beside himself. Buddy was well known and loved in the neighborhood, a gentle dog who spent his afternoons lying in the sun, greeting passing neighbors with a wag of his tail. He was never a nuisance, never off-leash, and certainly not harming any ecosystem. But before anyone could figure out what the note meant, we learned the full truth. Karen had called animal control and reported Buddy as a stray, claiming he was unlicensed, aggressive, and a danger to wildlife. By the time we pieced everything together, Buddy had already been picked up and taken to a shelter. Mr. Thompson looked absolutely devastated as he sat on his porch, staring at the note in his hands. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "She did this just to get under my skin." I clenched my fists, rage bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had gone after an innocent old man's dog, deliberately trying to hurt him. And she was winning. Neighbors came together, offering to call the shelter, donate money for any fees, and even drive out there to bring Buddy home. But when confronted, Karen simply shrugged. "I was enforcing the rules," she said in that same smug, infuriating tone. "Maybe next time he'll keep his mud off my property." I couldn't take it anymore. I had tried to stay calm. I had ignored her first few warnings, hoping she would get bored and move on. But now, it was clear, Karen thrived on control. She wasn't going to stop until she made life miserable for everyone around her. I spent the next day gathering every piece of evidence I could. The fake notices. The kayak destruction footage. The security camera footage from Buddy's disappearance. I was going to the HOA board, and I was going to take Karen down. But before I could, she escalated things even further. That Saturday, the lake was calm and inviting, the kind of day that made me remember why we moved here in the first place. Ethan and Caleb had been hesitant to go back to the water since the kayak incident, but after some reassurance, they asked if they could just walk along the shore, maybe dip their feet in. I saw no harm in it. "Stay close to our property line," I reminded them, watching from the porch as they stepped onto the sand. It was peaceful, the sun sparkling across the water, their laughter carried by the gentle breeze. Then I saw her. Karen was storming down the slope, phone clutched in her hand, her red blazer an eyesore against the green backdrop of the pines. My stomach clenched as she marched straight up to my kids, pointing a finger at them like they were criminals. "You are trespassing on private property. Get away from the water this instant." Caleb, startled, took a step back, his foot slipping on a smooth rock. Ethan instinctively reached out to steady him, both of them looking up at her in shock. I was already halfway down the yard when Karen dialed her phone and began speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, 911. I need immediate assistance. There are trespassers on my property. They are refusing to leave and actively damaging the lake." My jaw dropped. She was actually calling emergency services on two kids standing ankle-deep in the water. I reached them just as she ended the call, her expression triumphant. "You're out of control," I said, barely containing my fury. She smirked. "The police will handle you." Minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of my house. The officer stepped out, looking between us, clearly expecting some kind of violent confrontation. What he found instead was two confused kids standing by the water and a middle-aged woman glaring at them like they'd committed a felony. Karen launched into a dramatic retelling of the incident, insisting my children were trespassing on her lakefront, disturbing protected wildlife, and violating subsection 14 of some imaginary law. The officer turned to me. "Do you have proof of your property lines?" Without hesitation, I handed over my property deed. He scanned it, nodded, and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, this portion of the shoreline belongs to them." Karen's face twisted with disbelief. "That's incorrect. I have documentation." The officer raised a brow. "Then show me." Karen fumbled with her clipboard, flipping through pages of typed rules with no official seals or signatures. The officer's patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am," he said, "this isn't legal documentation. And calling 911 for non-emergency situations like this is an abuse of emergency services." Karen's face flushed an angry red. "You're taking his side? He forged those documents." The officer sighed. "If you believe that, you can take it to civil court. But you can't keep calling us over property disputes that don't exist." Karen was fuming, but she couldn't argue with the law. She turned on her heel and stomped back toward her house, muttering about taking this to the highest level. Ethan and Caleb peeked at me, relieved the police hadn't sided with Karen. I exhaled, shaking my head. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because now, I wasn't just defending my kids. I was making sure Karen never pulled this stunt on anyone else again. After the 911 stunt, Karen had finally overplayed her hand. The moment the officer dismissed her so-called legal documentation and warned her against abusing emergency services, I saw the cracks forming in her carefully constructed world of fake authority. But knowing Karen, she wasn't going to back down quietly. I had to be ready for whatever she did next. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I had, the security footage of her stealing and destroying my kid's kayak, the fake fines she had taped to my door, the notice she left after calling animal control on Mr. Thompson's dog, and the audio recording from the police incident where she tried, and failed, to prove she owned the lake. I also spoke to as many neighbors as possible, asking if they'd had similar run-ins with her. The response was overwhelming. One man admitted she had once threatened to call Child Protective Services on him because his teenage son had been fishing near the water without proper supervision. Another woman said Karen had demanded she pay a community fine after leaving her canoe too close to the shore. One family, new like us, revealed that Karen had forced them to move their patio furniture because it was obstructing the natural lake view. The stories were endless. It was clear Karen had ruled this neighborhood with fear for years. But now? People were finally ready to fight back. The next homeowners association meeting couldn't come soon enough. When the night finally arrived, the community center was packed. Normally, HOA meetings were lucky to get 5 or 6 attendees, but tonight? There had to be at least 50 people. Some I recognized, others I didn't. But one thing was clear, everyone was here because of Karen. I spotted her immediately, sitting near the front, clutching a thick binder to her chest like it was her personal constitution. Her expression was smug, as if she had already won. But that confidence faltered when she noticed how many people had come to the meeting, and worse, how many of them were staring directly at her with thinly veiled resentment. Jessica, a Real HOA board member, cleared her throat and opened the meeting. "All right, we'll start with general announcements, and then we'll move to open concerns." Before she could continue, Karen shot to her feet, practically shoving the binder onto the table. "I'd like to address an urgent matter before anything else," she said sharply. Jessica raised an eyebrow but motioned for her to continue. Karen flipped open the binder, revealing pages upon pages of typed-up nonsense. "I have spent years ensuring the protection of our lake," she declared, voice ringing through the room. "And yet, I have been personally attacked, harassed, and disrespected by those who refused to abide by the preservation guidelines. I leaned back in my chair, waiting. Just this week, she continued dramatically, I had to call emergency services because of trespassers on my property. My private shoreline has been overrun by reckless individuals who have no respect for history, conservation, or the law. And now, I am being vilified for enforcing the rules. A few murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Mr. Thompson scoffed audibly. Jessica gave her a level look. Karen, as we've discussed before, the HOA does not recognize a Lake Preservation Committee. Your committee does not exist under our bylaws. Karen's eye twitched. Well, it should exist, she shot back. Someone has to regulate things. Otherwise, people will just do whatever they want. That's called property ownership, I said coolly, standing up. And since you brought it up, I'd like to share some evidence regarding your so-called regulations. I pulled out the folder I had prepared, filled with printed copies of everything, deeds, real HOA rules, the fake violations Karen had issued, screenshots from neighbors' security cameras, even the police report confirming that she had falsely called 911 on my kids. I turned to the crowd. I moved here thinking this was a community, not a dictatorship. But from the day I arrived, Karen has treated my family, and many of you, as if she owns the entire lake. She has issued fake fines, destroyed property, harassed children, and even tried to have an innocent dog taken away. Several people nodded in agreement, and a few openly murmured things like, "Enough is enough," and, "She's been doing this for years." Karen let out a forced laugh. "This is ridiculous. You're making baseless accusations." I turned to Jessica. "Would you like to see the video footage?" Jessica nodded, and I handed my phone to her. She played the clip of Karen sneaking onto my property at night, dragging away my kid's kayak, and tossing it near a trash bin. Gasps filled the room. Jessica's face darkened. "Karen, this is destruction of property." Karen went pale. That doesn't prove anything," she stammered. I pulled out another document. This is a copy of the letter she left after calling animal control on Mr. Thompson's dog. A licensed, leashed dog, by the way. Mr. Thompson stood up. "I almost lost Buddy because of you," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You had no right." More voices joined in. "She tried to fine me for putting my boat on my own dock. She told my kids they weren't allowed near the water. She told me she was on the HOA board, she's not even on the board." Karen's smug expression had completely vanished. She looked around, her grip on the binder tightening. Jessica exhaled sharply, looking at her fellow board members. "It's clear this has gone too far. Karen, you do not have any authority over this community. Effective immediately, the HOA will formally acknowledge that your Lake Preservation Committee is illegitimate. You have no right to enforce anything." Karen's face twisted in rage. "You can't do this. I own." "You don't own anything," I cut in. "In fact, I did some digging. You're not even a homeowner." The room went dead silent. A neighbor whispered, "Wait, what?" I held up the last document. Karen rents her home. She doesn't even own the property she's been harassing people over. Her landlord does. Karen's mouth fell open. Jessica turned to Karen, her voice deadly calm. "So let me get this straight, you've been threatening property owners with fake fines, while you're not even a property owner yourself?" Karen stammered, her face going blotchy with fury. "That's irrelevant. That doesn't change anything. The lake belongs to my family's history." Jessica shook her head. "This meeting is over." The entire room erupted. People clapped, cheered, some even laughed in sheer disbelief. Karen, completely humiliated, grabbed her binder and bolted for the door, shoving past people as she went. And just like that, her reign was over. But I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. People like Karen never go down without one final, desperate move. The question was, how far would she go before reality finally caught up with her? 2 days after the HOA meeting, Karen was nowhere to be seen. For someone who had spent years patrolling the lake like a self-appointed sheriff, her sudden disappearance was almost eerie. But I knew it wasn't over yet. People like Karen never go down without a fight. And sure enough, she left one last desperate move. A bright orange lake violation notice was taped across my front door, this time in huge, bold letters, declaring that I had habitually disregarded lake preservation laws, and that I was now facing legal action and potential fines exceeding $5,000. I actually laughed when I saw it. After everything she had been exposed for, she was still trying to play her game. The difference now was that nobody was falling for it anymore. The neighborhood had finally woken up. Neighbors began tearing down the bogus signs Karen had posted near the lake, reclaiming their property, and even talking about hosting a Lake Freedom barbecue, a not-so-subtle celebration of her downfall. The final nail in the coffin came when her landlord, now furious over the multiple police visits, HOA complaints, and growing social media attention, issued her an eviction notice. Karen had been lying about her authority while not even paying rent on time. The irony was almost too perfect. For the next 2 weeks, people quietly watched from their porches as Karen packed her things into a moving truck, ranting into her phone the entire time. Some claimed she was calling a lawyer. Others whispered that she was trying to get someone from the city involved. But it was useless, her power trip had finally come to an end. On her final day, she stomped around the lake one last time, snapping photos like she was building a last-minute legal case. A few neighbors filmed her meltdown, shaking their heads. But there were no police, no last-minute victories. Just a woman who had spent years terrorizing a community, now reduced to nothing but an angry tenant with no control left. As the moving truck pulled away, my kids ran back toward the lake, finally free to enjoy it the way they had always dreamed. Other families joined, laughing, splashing, and bringing life back to the shoreline Karen had tried so hard to control. Even Mr. Thompson, after everything, had a peaceful smile on his face as Buddy trotted beside him. The community was stronger than before, united by the battle we had fought together. In the weeks that followed, I heard rumors that Karen was still complaining online, posting in neighborhood groups about how she had been wrongfully evicted and that she would sue everyone involved. But no one listened. Instead, the viral video of her screaming at the police and trying to enforce her fake laws became an internet sensation. People from all over the country commented things like, "Classic Karen move," and "This is why HOAs are terrifying." Even the local police chief made it clear they would not be taking her calls anymore. And just like that, the lake was finally free. No more fake rules. No more phony fines. No more power-hungry dictator in a red blazer. Just families enjoying their homes the way they were meant to. But it makes you wonder, how many Karens are still out there, making life miserable for their neighbors, convinced they're the ones in charge? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.